back to History Class with Dr. W. In the previous lecture, we talked about George Washington's presidency and the cabinet. And in this lecture, we're going to continue talking about Washington's presidency, and in particular, the profound influence of his Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Washington's presidency was characterized by an intense clash between his two most prominent cabinet members, Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, who's pictured here on the left, and Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of Treasury, pictured on the right. Jefferson himself said that he and Hamilton were, quote, pitted against each other every day in the cabinet like two fighting cocks. It is from these two men that our two-party system as a nation is born, and we're going to talk a lot more about that process in future lectures. And in the next couple of slides, we're going to be talking about the divide between Jefferson and Hamilton. So Jefferson and Hamilton went head-to-head on a number of important issues during Washington's presidency. At the heart of the matter was the power of the federal government versus the power of the state governments. And remember that Hamilton, as a Federalist, was one of the early champions of a strong federal government. Hamilton also tended to lean more towards England as his model and maintaining closer ties to England. Jefferson was more of a Republican in the true classical sense of the word, believing that the states should have more power than the federal government, and that the nation should break ties with England and grow closer to France. Jefferson envisioned an agrarian, expansive nation rather than an urban, industrial nation, which is what Hamilton's preferred model was. Hamilton was a great champion of manufacturing. Thomas Jefferson supported the French Revolution, which we're going to be talking about a bit later, and he actually had deep personal connections to France and preferred siding with France in a number of different ways. He thought that Federalists were taking on heirs of the old aristocracy, and he didn't like that, although Jefferson himself was something of an aristocrat. He lived on a mountaintop, owned slaves, and so on. And so there were some contradictions in Jefferson's perspective on things. Hamilton, as we've noted, was an illegitimate son from the Caribbean, an immigrant. He was a great risk taker. During the Revolutionary War, he was one of George Washington's closest aides, and some scholars have noted that Hamilton in some ways was like a son to George Washington. Hamilton, as it happened, married up. He married into a very prominent and wealthy New York family, ultimately became a lawyer. And so these two are at odds with each other throughout Washington's presidency. As one historian has put it, Hamilton feared anarchy and loved order. Jefferson feared tyranny and loved liberty. And so really the heart of this conflict is one between liberty and order. And if you think about it, one always comes at the expense of the other. And it is this conflict that forms the foundation of our early two-party system, and in many ways persists as one of the core conflicts between our two parties even today. The 1790s were an era that were fraught with peril and all kinds of conflict on many different fronts. As we've noted, one thing evolving during these years is the beginnings of our nation's two-party system. The first parties were the Federalists, who had been the so-called friends of the Constitution, like Alexander Hamilton, who had worked to create the Constitution. The Republican Party comes along just a few years later, during Washington's presidency, who began to have doubts about many of the aspects of the new government and the way things were run. Now, looking back on this period generally, Thomas Jefferson in 1813 recalled that the public discussions in that era, whether relating to men, measures, or opinions, were conducted by the parties with animosity, a bitterness, and an indecency which had never been exceeded. All the resources of reason and of wrath were exhausted by each party in support of its own, and to the prostrate the adversary opinions. And so we're going to talk about that as well, the ways in which the evolving parties kind of went after each other. In 1796, Jefferson commented, "Men who have been intimate all their lives cross the streets to avoid meeting and turn their heads the other way, lest they should be obliged to touch their hats." And as we will see, a number of friendships and collaborative relationships between the so-called founding fathers crumbled during the animosity of the 1790s. Jefferson is essentially estranged from George Washington, and in some ways John Adams, although they rekindled a friendship years later. And of course Jefferson and Hamilton were deeply at odds with each other, but Hamilton also fell out with his former collaborator and partner, James Madison. Now, the 1790s themselves were a turbulent decade. A series of yellow fever epidemics swept across the country. There were also recurrent financial panics during this period as the economy moved forward in fits and starts. We're going to be talking about things like violent protests and taxpayer revolts that sometimes lead to violence. We will eventually talk about the Sedition Act, which some saw as un-American and others saw as essential for the governing of the country. There were occasional scuffles even within Congress, and at least one of those erupted into outright violence when one member of the House was stabbed on the floor. And then, of course, the final footnote to this era is the notorious pistol duel between the vice president himself, Aaron Burr, which ended the life of Alexander Hamilton. So as we talk about the beginnings of a two-party system, which even in the early years was different from what we know today, there are some paradoxes within this idea of a two-party system. And at that time, we have to note that the parties stuck to their principles and had their beliefs, and yet they also understood that compromise was necessary. And so in many instances, you have these really kind of brutal knockdown, drag-out debates between the two sides, and yet they result in something getting done. Somebody at some point recognizes that we have to compromise, we have to try to work together for the greater good. And I talked in a previous lecture about the idea of civic virtue, and I think at the end of the day, that quality of civic virtue still persists even as we have some pretty ugly clashes between the two sides. We're also, as a nation and as political bodies, beginning to understand just the mechanisms of government. And both sides come to realize just how influential and powerful the presidency can be. In the early years of the Republic, the thought was that the Senate would be the most powerful body and that the House was going to be tremendously important. But the presidency comes to be the ultimate prize. And by the end of the period we're discussing here, by the election of 1800, both sides will be campaigning for that prize. There was some thought early on that there would be no need for political parties or factions, as they were called at that time. The Federalists thought that once the new Constitution was adopted, and certainly after the Bill of Rights had been added to it, that there would be no need for factions within the government. And if you just look at the breakdown of the early Congress, in which roughly 11 of the first 59 representatives and 2 of the first 20 senators were anti-Federalists, so the great majority in both houses were Federalists, the thought of a second party evolving was a distant one in some people's minds. And yet it becomes clear, particularly with the rise of the Republican Party, which develops largely out of opposition to Hamilton's policies, that indeed we are going to have parties in this country. Even as the early parties evolved, George Washington proved to be a critical presence in moderating the tensions between the two sides. Thomas Jefferson described Washington by saying, in every sense of the words, he is a wise, a good man, and a great man. And it may truly be said that never did nature and fortune combine more perfectly to make a man great, and to place him in the same constellation with whatever worthies have merited from man an everlasting remembrance. And so Washington is able to hold his cabinet together and keep people from crumbling the government out from under him just by the weight of his presence and his seriousness. He is able to keep things together. Saying that, the political parties did begin to evolve, initially out of principled disagreements over policy. They were not about winning elections, strictly speaking, in the beginning. But the Republicans did recognize that, in particular, trying to win the House of Representatives, in which there was an election 2 years after the election of Washington, that they would need to do some campaigning, that there would need to be some coalescing in what we would describe now as partisan political ways. And yet early on, the Federalists are able to hold sway, and really throughout Washington's presidency, it is the Federalists who predominate in determining policy, and particularly around the figure of Alexander Hamilton. In 1790 and 1791, Alexander Hamilton wrote a series of vitally important reports that ultimately shaped America's, particularly their economic policies going forward, but also lended to this kind of federal dominance in the early years of our nation. He wrote reports on the public credit, a national bank, the establishment of mints, and manufacturers. And all of these reports are very important. Hamilton looked to the British as a model, which again is going to be troublesome to some of his Republican opponents. One of the vital issues that Hamilton addressed in these various reports was the idea of repaying Revolutionary War debt. There were many different types of paper currency that had been floating around during the Revolutionary War years, and some of those had fallen subject to speculation, particularly as the war was ending and thoughts of a new nation were beginning to arise. People were kind of cashing in their various paper currencies or selling them to speculators to try to just get something out of them, while the speculators were hoping that the government would repay those debts in full. According to Hamilton, those debts did need to be paid in full at face value, even if some of that would reward speculators. This was important, though, to restore the credit of the nation on the whole and to put us on a solid economic footing in general. And ultimately, Hamilton's policy was adopted. Similarly, he advocated a national bank, and he advocated various taxes, including a whiskey tax, which were also adopted by the new government. And so it is in opposition to these Hamiltonian policies that the Republican Party is really born. Opposing these ideas of Hamilton forms the foundation of the new Republican Party. But as I mentioned early on, Alexander Hamilton, the Federalists, George Washington are all on sort of a winning streak as all of these policies are adopted by the government. So the Republicans begin asking, how do we fight back? How do we push back against this? And one answer to that is to rally public opinion in opposition to these Federalist policies. And so we're going to talk about that in the next lecture and how the press and public opinion plays into the growing two-party system.